Tonight, we won't open ledgers filled with theories or point to diagrams of falling stars. Instead, we will stand under a Siberian sky so wide it feels like the earth forgot to give it edges. The air is cool, the kind that tastes of pine and river water, the kind that keeps its secrets. Here, in the early summer of 1908, the wind moves slowly, unaware that it is about to carry the loudest story it will ever tell. Some say the morning began with a strange light rolling over the horizon, pale at first, then gathering itself until it burned like a second sun. Others remember a silence so deep it felt as if the forest were listening. And then, too late for anyone to prepare, the sky broke open. So lower the lights. Let the quiet press against your shoulders like the weight of evening air before a storm. And if your breathing begins to match the slow swing of the treetops under that distant blast, that's just the memory of the taiga carrying you with it. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next wind that crosses this story will be waiting for you there. And when it comes, it will carry the voices of those who saw the sky catch fire before they heard it, herders on the tundra. Fishermen along the river, families who woke to a light so fierce it erased the shadows of their own homes. Their words, gathered like fallen leaves decades later, are all we have to understand the morning when Siberia looked up and found the heavens burning. The morning near the Tunguska River began with a glare rolling in from the northeast before the sun itself had risen, as if daylight had taken a shortcut across the taiga. Witnesses said the sky split open and stitched itself again with a seam of fire so bright it carved shadows into the earth. Light raced over the ground like water before lifting back into the air. Birds argued with silence and lost. Far away, a clerk closing a window against a summer draft paused when the glass trembled as though someone had exhaled on it from the other side. Then the sound arrived late, as great noises often do, because the air needed time to carry the message. Forests bowed in every direction, trees snapping as if they had forgotten which way was up. The shockwave ran outward, a circular verdict, and paragraphs in Britain, Germany, and Italy scribbled startled loops across their paper rolls. The way a pen jumps when a table is struck from below. People along the river spoke of a wind that tore roofs from houses, of sled dogs crawling under boats, of reindeer bolting in panic. Telegraph operators in distant towns wrote to each other about a disturbance moving faster than gossip and twice as certain. That night, the high atmosphere glowed in strange pearly bands. People in London read newspapers outdoors at midnight under skies that had forgotten to be dark. In Siberia, hunters counted seconds between light and sound until they ran out of numbers before the blast arrived. The forest lay down in a giant radial pattern as though pressed flat by an invisible hand. Bark was scorched on the side that had faced the shock wave. Fire swept through but could not keep pace with the blast itself. Even now, a century later, the trees that grew back seem young, as if the land itself has not quite finished recovering from the day the sky caught fire. That leads, almost lazily, into theories that do not retire. Scientists, who are like kindly librarians for doubt, proposed at once what now seems too tidy. A cosmic intruder, call it a stony asteroid or an icy comet fragment, entered the atmosphere with more confidence than judgment, warmed itself into pieces, and released its energy in an airburst a few kilometers up, sparing the soil a crater while being unkind to trees. Energy estimates wander between 5 and 15 megatons, sentences that sound like numbers trying to imagine thunder. The altitude may have been 8 kilometers, or 5, or some reasonable point where air becomes reluctantly solid. The object's size is given as a house, then a building, then a small hill, depending on which equation is in a generous mood and how fast you choose to let the guest arrive. Comet advocates like the absence of leftover chunks. Asteroidal partisans point to microscopic spherules in peat and a flavor of nickel that suggests stone rather than snow. Some say Lake Checo nearby is a belated crater filling itself with dignity, and others point out that lakes have long histories of being lakes without needing trajectories. A microhook that makes mathematicians smile. A body with the right angle and speed experiences the atmosphere as a wall that moves. It is the celestial equivalent of walking into a sliding glass door you thought was open. More imaginative suggestions keep knocking politely. A stray clump of antimatter would have been dramatic in a way the soil would remember loudly. It did not happen. A black hole the size of a pebble would go through the earth like a needle through cloth and complain at the other side. Nothing complained. Alien craft is useful for magazines and not very helpful for tree rings. The most durable alternate is a comet fragment because comets are theatrical dissolvers. You can say ice and dust with a shrug that forgives the lack of leftovers. Meanwhile, the sky keeps its own minutes. Witnesses reported a series of bangs rather than one, which fits a breakup like beads. The barograph traces show several pulses. The soundscape agrees with pictures drawn on the backs of envelopes. If you hold Chelyabinsk in 2013 beside Tunguska, like two postcards pinned to a corkboard, you see cousins, a daytime fireball, an atmospheric slap, glass that suddenly learns about pressure, then bright contrails that draw punctuation across a morning. The difference is scale and audience. Tunguska performed to a sparse crowd and left a wider autograph. A gentle irony is that we argue most vividly where the evidence is quietest. The object as exact identity, its mass and angle, the flavor of its last thought. That the airburst explanation likes to sit in the middle of the room and pour tea while the wilder hypotheses circle, sniff, and then drift toward the window. The taiga does not mind. Trees have long practice hosting unverifiable opinions. Claims of cover-up make their own cozy nest in any story that begins in an empire and ends in a different country. Here the delay is an ordinary one. Distance, mud, politics, and weather ran a relay. The explosion happened in 1908. An organized scientific expedition did not reach the epicenter until 1927, led by Leonid Kulik, a man patient enough to collect meteorites and unbothered by marshes that have personality. In between came revolutions, wars, and railway timetables that misunderstood ambition. You can cross the distance on a map with your finger in a second. On foot it took months and the cooperation of reindeer who had their own plans. Kulik expected a crater and found a pattern instead trees all lying away from a point, as if the ground had exhaled with persuasion. He interviewed Iwanki hunters who had watched the sky unravel and discovered that memory in forests is a mosaic. Each witness kept a tile of the picture and offered it carefully. He stood on a hill and thought he saw melted soil. Later, he called it something more modest. Papers in Moscow were read and misread by editors with deadlines. Rumors added punctuation no one had ordered. Much later, writers accused early Soviet officers of hiding a secret weapon test. The weapon in question would have needed a laboratory not yet invented, an accountant willing to misplace a son, and a forest that agreed to be plausibly surprised. There were experiments in the early Soviet years that ended without applause, but none wrote on barographs in London. Another soft controversy. Why did it take 19 years to send a proper expedition? There is no romance in the answer. Northern summers turn ground into stew. Northern winters ask impossible questions of sleds. Funds argue with roads, and roads prefer to disagree. And yet the local people went on living there, which is the best data point we rarely cite. The land healed itself in grass and mushrooms. Birds stopped holding committee meetings about the trees and simply nested in the new ones. When you read Kulik's notes, you glimpse an investigator who fell in love with absence. He looked for iron and found stories, which can be heavier than iron if you carry them long enough. Subsequent expeditions, Soviet, then Russian, then international, did their best to be less romantic. They cored peat and dated charcoal layers that know how to keep calendars. They mapped the fall pattern the way a tailor maps cloth. The bureaucracy in some decades was a fog, in others it was a light snow. In none of them did it resemble a curtain designed to hide aliens. Conspiracy stories prefer velvet, archives prefer dust. One moves better in wind than the other. What remains, even after sensible explanations sit politely in chairs, is a good mystery's quiet core, a part that does not object to being solved and also does not promise. Modern science, which wears 2 watches to be sure, says airburst and points to models where objects of 40, 50, or 60 meters enter at shallow angles and find the atmosphere both hospitable and terminal. It says the energy would flatten trees out to 40 kilometers or more, and the rings on trunks would count the year of the blast as a growth moment paused by stress. It says the noctilucent clouds, seen over Europe, were the sky's way of trying on a new dress made of dust and ice. Legends gathered alongside. A god's anger, a punishment for neglecting a ritual, a fragment of the sun that slipped on its own light. They coexist comfortably. Bedtime is generous that way. If you ask what would happen today, the answer arrives with recent rehearsal. In 2013, over Chelyabinsk, a bolide entered without an invitation, flashed its way into a few hundred kilotons, and taught Windows how to behave badly. More than 1,000 people were cut by flying glass because humans like to go to Windows when something bright happens. Curiosity has a manual and never reads it. Tunguska scaled that event up by a factor of 10 or more and placed it over a district where reindeer outnumbered opinions. If the same thing occurred above a city, the zone of flattened trees would translate to a zone of altered buildings. The energy would rearrange streets into recipes. The pressure wave would treat windows like brief ideas. This is why telescopes now keep watch on small near-Earth objects as if they were cats about to assess a stack of plates. Planetary defense sounds heroic until you realize it is mostly scheduling. Find the rocks early, nudge them gently, write reports in fonts the budget committee respects. Even with all that, the sublime part persists. The earth moves through a garden of pebbles that sometimes remember to be stones. Most pass like thoughts you forgot to think. A few arrive loudly and leave only air rearranged and trees conversing about direction. Scientists will go on ruling out what it wasn't: antimatter, a black hole with a taste for timber, a craft from a magazine's afternoon, and refine what it likely was. They will argue with affectionate equations about density and angle and fragmentation altitude because that is how precision stays awake without getting cranky. And they will keep one eye on the upper air, reading the faint signatures left by pressure waves that travel politely around the world and knock on the doors of instruments and stations that used to be weather huts and are now networks with excellent manners. If you're still awake, you can imagine the long, flat plain after a summer rain, the teenaged birches, the mushrooms arguing quietly under leaves, and somewhere a little wooden post left by a survey crew with a pencil mark that weather will forgive by winter. If you have wandered off towards sleep, the sky will go on keeping minutes. The barographs will make their neat scratches at the right times, and the forest will continue its slow practice of not remembering alarm too loudly. The world has many ways of telling a story. The quietest of them work best when the listener is almost dreaming and the lights have distant. Cities like those strange pearly nights after the blast are content to glow without anyone insisting on a moral. You might not expect a metal cylinder to have a social life, but for more than a century, the most famous kilogram in the world lived under 3 glass bell jars and still managed to keep appointments with scientists who spoke to it in whispers. The cylinder did not move. The people did. They came to a quiet vault near Paris, signed a book with tidy handwriting, and then watched as attendants wearing white cotton handled the bell jars one by one, like chefs revealing a dish that tasted only of accuracy. The object inside looked modest, which was comforting. It was a small, silvery piece of platinum iridium about the size of a plum pudding that had mislaid the pudding. The room was cooler than conversation and smelled faintly of wax, metal, and decisions. If you re still awake when we get to the moment, someone washed the kilogram with alcohol and steam as if it were a very shy teacup. Feel free to subscribe in a way that leaves no fingerprints. If sleep arrives before that, the bell jars will stay where they are, and the cylinder will continue doing nothing with exemplary discipline. The story of how that cylinder came to be important is a gentle march of numbers that wanted a home. For centuries, people used local notions of length and weight that were as dependable as a handshake and about as standardized. A yard could be the king's arm on a day when the tailor had influence. A pound could be a merchant's favorite stone if the merchant was persuasive. It all worked until trade crossed rivers and then oceans and discovered that ambiguity scales poorly. During the French Revolution, amid a hurricane of very loud events, a quiet committee proposed a system so rational it could sleep standing up. 1 meter would be 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole, along a meridian that agreed to behave. 1 kilogram would be the mass of a liter of water at its most cooperative temperature. This sounded simple in the way clouds look simple from far away. Measuring a planet with 18th century instruments required surveys, triangulations, and notebooks that enjoyed rain less than people did. Trying to define mass by water introduced the problem that water is moody and likes to stick to glass. In the end, they did something elegant and human. They built physical stand-ins, a bar for length, a cylinder for mass. Here, they essentially said to the future, please treat this as what we mean. It was a very polite leap of faith. The kilogram's particular cylinder was cast in the 1880s out of a 90-tenths platinum iridium alloy chosen because platinum resists corrosion and iridium resists fun. The alloy yields a sheen that looks both aristocratic and bored. The surface was polished until it could imagine recognizing itself. The final mass was corrected by removing telltale flecks with a tool that would rather not be named, because the instrument for making 1 kilogram exactly 1 kilogram is mostly restrained. The cylinder moved into a vault at the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, where it acquired its stage name, the International Prototype of the Kilogram. To keep it company, exact copies were made and assigned to countries that had signed the Meter Convention, a treaty whose drama level never rises above firm handshake. Each copy received a number. Some went into national vaults. Some spent time traveling inside padded cases to laboratories where scales waited with manners. An entire new profession emerged, people who escort kilograms. They traveled by train and ship with diplomatic papers for items the size of a paperweight. Customs officials stamped forms that say things like 1 kilogram, but really 1 kilogram. The micro hook here is that the Object S job was to be boring so that anything else could be interesting. To compare weights, you need scales that do not enjoy being impressed. The balance used for the kilogram is an instrument that listens to gravity and then asks for a second opinion. It has arms, knives, agate bearings, and a way of adjusting that looks a little like instilling confidence in a nervous friend. When a national prototype visited Paris, it was placed on one pan while the international prototype rested on the other. The balance noticed the difference to astonishing sensitivity. People recorded the results in ledgers where numbers align like soldiers, who also happen to be careful librarians. The comparisons happened at intervals measured by the patience of budgets. Every few decades, a campaign would be scheduled in kilograms from around the world, each in its own nested case, the cases inside. Cases like wooden dolls that studied logistics would arrive and wait their turn attended by scientists who never hurried on purpose. A typical report from one of these campaigns reads like a novel written by punctuation, plus or minus micrograms a comma. A parenthetical about air density, a sigh about cleaning protocols, a reminder that gravity is not the same everywhere if you're fussy enough. Now we can drift. the way a feather insists on drifting, to the problem that eventually made everyone speak more softly around the vault. The cylinder under the bell jars did not weigh itself, it simply existed. But comparison suggested that the object might be changing, not by much. A few micrograms treasured enough to make headlines only in newsletters for people who keep microscopes spotless. Still, if the kilogram that defines kilograms is not perfectly constant, then everything else measured against it inherits a faint collective shrug. To deal with this, the community kept the cylinders as clean as policy allowed. A schedule existed for grooming. The procedure was literal and soothing. First a shower of pure alcohol, then a steam bath from boiling distilled water, and finally a slow drying, all done by someone trained not to think about lunch during the process. After cleaning, the kilogram looked exactly the same to the human eye, which is one reason the procedure worked. Nobody became proud. The records show that cleaning removed contaminant films built molecule by molecule from the air, from the glass, from time's breath. The international prototype is rumored to have lost mass across the decades, though a calmer way to say it is that the comparison between it and its copies changed, which might be due to them gaining. In the kind of humor only standards can have, the object is accused of going on a diet even though it never left the house. We can walk around the vault now, quietly, as if the cylinders were sleeping. 3 bell jars, nested, sit over the prototype like a triple yawn. The air under them is clean enough to be on a postcard. A small balance lives in a nearby room and pretends not to be proud. The doors are sealed with wax because wax knows how to signal the difference between opened and not opened. The key is held by people with titles that imply they are not easily distracted. On certain days, the bell jars are lifted. The support ring is dusted with a brush that would like to hold a violin bow. Then nothing happens for some time, which is the procedure. You might expect a vault to feel like a treasury, but it behaves like a chapel. Even the floor believes in verticality. Attendants pass tins with gloves inside. The gloves work less like clothes and more like small moral agreements. Nearby, the meter prototype, another aristocrat of platinum iridium, rests in its own case, equally composed. The world uses these objects sparingly, the way you might use a family recipe card only on holidays and keep it in a sleeve the rest of the year. Because not everything that matters sits under glass. Copies of the kilogram developed personalities. One national prototype was dropped, gently, a single anecdote that can silence a lunchroom. Another was polished a touch too enthusiastically and became a cautionary tale. Some traveled to humid places and came home wearing films that had to be convinced to leave. Laboratories invented new ways to compare without handling. Weigh a mass in air, then vacuum, measure buoyancy, argue politely with the corrections. The old balances acquired electronic assistance that could read tilts imperceptible to neck muscles. A diagram appeared that shows a kilogram resting on a pan with arrows pointing everywhere. Gravity down, buoyancy up, draft sideways, anxiety in parentheses. If you fall asleep for a minute here, you will dream of tiny arrows having tiny meetings about corrections that take longer than tea. The pace of this could continue forever, and in another universe perhaps it does. But in ours, someone asked the reasonable question: could we define the kilogram without relying on a particular lump, however carefully dusted? The answer grew slowly out of physics that prefers constants to artifacts. You can define the meter by the speed of light, which obligingly does not change its mind. Could you define the kilogram by a constant as well? The Planck constant written h, with a lowercase modesty links energy and frequency, and kindly agrees to be the same on Mondays as on Fridays. If we could build a device that compared mechanical power to electrical power with exquisite seriousness, we could trap h in a definition and let the kilogram ride along. Enter the Kibble balance, named after Brian Kibble, who like to ask instruments for their better selves. It looks like a scale invented by a watchmaker with a fondness for electromagnets. In one mode, a current-carrying coil is held in a magnetic field and balances a test mass with a known force. In another mode, the coil is moved and the induced voltage is measured. With careful accounting and a bit of quantum voltage and resistance Josephson junctions here, quantum Hall effect there, the device links mass to H, the mathematics plays with elegance, the apparatus hums. Laboratories around the world built their versions. They disagreed in the small, then agreed in the small, which is the way friendship develops among machines. When the data became persuasive in a way that made even cautious metrologists nod, the international community voted to redefine the kilogram in 2018. Effective in 2019, overnight though. Night in standards means after years of drafts. The world retired the cylinder as a definition. The legacy of the cylinder is everywhere it isn't. Calibrated masses in industry still trace their ancestry to that vault, the way family trees trace themselves to a village, even when the village has a new bakery. Pharmacies, laboratories, factories, their balances now calibrate against national standards that themselves calibrate against kibble balances, which calibrate against H, which calibrates against the quiet tendency of the universe to be dependable when you ask gently enough. There is soft humor in a world where a bakery scale can claim a distant cousinage with quantum electrical standards. There is also comfort. You can buy a bag of rice and believe the label within a tolerance that you feel in your elbow but cannot articulate. That feeling is trust, and it rests on bell jars and vaults and committees that hold meetings about commas. We can take a small detour to the meter, not to distract, but to let the rhythm breathe. The meter, once a bar kept under glass, went through its own redefinitions until it became the distance light travels in a fraction of a second, defined so precisely that the second itself had to be redefined by cesium's impeccable vibrations. Standards have a social network. The second calls the meter in the morning. The meter relays messages to the kilogram. The kilogram, now happily married to H, writes thank you notes to electricity. If you listen at night, you can almost hear the units chatting through the walls of the SI system, promising to keep one another in line. It is all very boring and therefore very secure. Back with the kilogram, there are small rituals that persist even after the big change. Laboratories still carefully handle stainless steel weights and adjust for fingerprints, which are tiny acts of biography. Students still learn to lower a weight with 2 fingers and let it settle like a small animal that trusts you. Vacuum chambers still pump the air out of comparisons so buoyancy can stop showing off. And the old prototype still has birthdays of a sort. Anniversaries when people remember that an object once made the world's measurements agree by existing. It is possible to be sentimental about a cylinder. The sentiment is not about metal. It is about coordination, about the pleasure of a planet choosing to count the same way in different languages. If you are still with me, imagine the vault one last time. The attendants have gone home. The bell jars are silent hats. Dust tries to form an opinion and is rebuffed. The cylinder sits in a triangular cradle, doing what it has always done best, which is to be the same from one second to the next, in a way that calms people who think about seconds for a living. Somewhere far away, a kibble balance hums and weighs a mass using voltage steps the size of small certainties. The balance's coil moves exactly as far as math would like. An equation smiles privately. In a factory, a scale zeroes itself. In a kitchen, flour is measured by a hand that judges better than the scale, and both agree to be friends. None of this needs to be dramatic to be essential. The kilogram's secret was never importance, it was steadiness. That is a trait we usually notice only when it is absent. Here, it is the whole point. And if at some point you dozed while we were washing metal with steam or counting commas in a definition, that's perfectly in tune with the subject. Standards exist so the rest of us don't have to stay awake worrying about them. The bell jars keep their glossy vigil. The vault keeps its temperature with the focus of a monk. The number H sits in its new role, tidy and pleased. Tomorrow, if you need to weigh something small, your scale will be there. It will shrug a little at drafts, make peace with the table, blink a familiar display, and report a result that is quietly connected to a cylinder that outlived its job by doing it very well. The world runs on these unadvertised agreements, and they make for excellent lullabies. Daily life in the catalog hummed like a refrigerator. New books arrived with the smell of hope were checked against orders and invoices, and then were given to catalogers who read title pages as if they were telegrams, extracting names and places that had no intention of being coy. A heading was chosen with love and rules. A call number was assembled with blocks. Cards were typed, or dymo tape was made for spine labels that refused to curl. Meanwhile, the circulation department slipped cards into pockets in the backs of books. Those date-due slips and their rubber stamps made a soundtrack, a steady clop that turned afternoons into measurable progress. The stamp style left ridges in the ink pad. The day's number sometimes wore a halo of extra ink, as if the date had decided to be celebratory. Readers approached the catalog with the diplomacy of people joining a conversation midstream. Some stood, some leaned, some sat with a drawer perched like a well-behaved dog on the edge. Fingers learned a rhythm, lift the rod, set the weight, flick, flick, pause. Found cards were lifted gently to eye level, read, and then either copied into a notebook or tucked back like a bird returned to a nest. The abbreviation IL became a friendly sight to art students. Bibliography, p. 213 to 221, was a promise to historians. Maps caused geographers to write in all caps. At the desk, the circulation clerk took the borrower's card and the book's card, married them briefly in a tray, and later divorced them with equal ceremony when the book came home. Some libraries used a stamping machine that chomped the due date through a small window in the pocket. Others wrote in pencil with a flair that made due dates look like small jazz. Even the repairs were restful. A card's corner torn by enthusiasm could be mended with transparent mending tissue pressed under a bone folder that had opinions about smoothness. A drawer that stuck could be persuaded with a sliver of wax rubbed along its runners. If a card went missing rare and felt like losing a sock, the cataloger reconstructed it from the book itself and from a telepathic bond with the filing rules. In the back offices, someone maintained an authority file, a set of cards that decided which form of a name or subject was official. This file was the catalog's conscience. Twain Mark pointed firmly to Clement Samuel, and nobody minded being corrected by a card that had done its homework. Walk with me to the micro-history of edge-notch cards because they sound like a magic trick and feel like dinnerware. These were special cards with little semicircular notches along the edges. Librarians could punch out certain notches to mark features, language, format, year, and then slide a long needle through a chosen notch position and lift the deck to let only matching cards fall free. It was data filtering by gravity and optimism. For small catalogs and private collections, it offered the thrill of database queries without electricity. The needle sounded like an idea being underlined. It is impossible to perform this without smiling at how well a low-tech idea can imitate a high-tech behavior when nobody is looking. There were misadventures, of course, told softly in staff rooms. A drawer dropped upside down produced an hour of philosophical sorting, followed by valuable silence. A patron refiled a card under the, and a lesson was taught using smaller words. Once, a toddler removed a rod and found agency. The incident later became a training scenario with a happy ending and a broom. But mostly, the catalog was a machine for preventing drama. A reader asked where the chemistry books lived, was offered QDs, and set off in the right direction. A professor suddenly needed every edition of a certain poem, and discovered them under the poet's name, nested like seasons. A person who had never used a catalog received 3 minutes of careful explanation that somehow implied lifelong membership in a club with no dues. Then the world changed in its famously undramatic way. Terminals appeared on tables, and Mark Rickards, machine-readable cataloging, the sort of acronym that stores allowed libraries to share data without envelopes. OCLC built a giant cooperative memory in Ohio where a book described in one place could be mirrored elsewhere with a click. The drawers did not vanish overnight. They were seated like a shoreline at low tide. Some libraries kept them for a generation so that habits could retire gracefully. Others sent them to storage and sold odd drawers to artists and botanists who wanted small compartments for seeds, screws, or spices. A few transformed into seed libraries, which feels like reincarnation. Cards that once pointed to knowledge now pointed to little packets of future plants, signed out with dates and hope. The metal rods were lifted one last time and stored in bundles that made janitors raise an eyebrow. The new catalogs glowed behind glass and allowed for searches that cards would have found immodest. Any word in any field, sorted by date, filtered by format, limited to items currently on shelf, whispered across consortia to borrow from cities you'll never visit. Subject headings still persisted, dressed now in clickable blue rather than black ink, and see also bloomed into hyperlinks that behaved like friendly tunnels. The work of catalogers changed less than you'd think. They still read title pages with suspicion and kindness, still chose headings, still argued the Oxford comma into submission. The difference was that keystrokes replaced typewriter bells, and a day's labor echoed through distant libraries, which felt, on the good days, like planting a forest by email. A few card catalogs remain as museum pieces or working nostalgias. Visitors slide a drawer and feel the weight of 4,000 modest sentences taking turns. The sound is still meteorological. In some places, the drawers are labeled by hand in a script that knows how to trust. The cards, slightly yellowed, contain the old addresses of knowledge, some pointing to books long withdrawn, some pointing to books that became classics without telling the catalog first. You can still learn the filing rules by touch. Saint is spelled out, then abbreviated, then respelled in eras that decided differently about sanctity and space. Accents on names behave according to periods when typewriters stalked them and periods when they did not. Every drawer is a timeline pretending to be a box. If you're still awake, picture the late afternoon in a university library circa 1978. The windows are tall. The light knows what angle to use. A student approaches the drawer labeled Music Beethoven and discovers 3 tight inches of cards, each with a promising line. Another student, in history, compares 2 subject headings and becomes quietly suspicious of how words shape what we look for. A librarian behind the desk stamps dates with emotion that has learned economy from thousands of repetitions. Upstairs, the stacked smell of paper and patience. Downstairs, a child on a tour is allowed to lift a rod and feels temporarily in charge of the alphabet. Outside, a delivery truck brings a box of preprinted cards from the Library of Congress, and inside, a cataloger slices the tape with a metal ruler that doubles as a wand when nobody is watching. And if you drifted off somewhere between the notches and the needle, the drawers keep their weather. They close themselves, flush with the cabinet. The brass label frames still reflect the room like small, polite mirrors. In the database world, servers hum and back up their memories at 2 a.m. without asking for applause. A subject heading is revised to make language kinder. The chain dribbles outward the way a finger drawn through a bowl of water persuades circles to appear. Tomorrow, someone will sit down at a terminal and type the name of an author, and a small list will bloom, each item leading to a shelf where spine labels stand like tidy flags. The old drawers will watch without envy. Their work taught us that questions deserve places to land. The quiet was not a side effect. It was the method. You can fall asleep to that idea and wake with it still there, like a card returned to the exact right spot in the alphabet, waiting for the next hand to approach without hurry. You might not expect a stack of glass to know the language of the sea, but a lighthouse lens speaks in light that travels farther than most conversations. It doesn't shout. It arranges itself into sheets and sends them outward the way a patient hand fans cards on a table. At dusk, a keeper turns a valve or strikes a match or touches a switch depending on the century that showed up that evening. And the great lantern wakes as slowly as a cat, remembering it is definitely a lion. The rim smells the way brass smells when it has been trying to be good, and the panes remember the day's salt. If you're still awake by the time we count how many prisms it takes to make a horizon feel noticed, feel free to subscribe in a manner as soft as a wick being coaxed. Or don't. The lens will keep turning either way, perfectly happy being admired by ships that never learn its name. A Fresnel lens, which is just French for glass that makes distance behave, doesn't look like a single thing so much as a polite crowd. Imagine a magnifying glass sliced into rings like an onion that volunteers for geometry. Each ring becomes a narrow prism, and all the prisms are arranged around a lantern like an organized halo. The result is a machine made of light, one that gathers rays that would otherwise wander and flattens them into a beam that treats clouds like suggestions. Engineers ranked these lenses by order, which is a tidy word for how big and serious. First order is the grand sort, taller than a tall person and with a focal length over 2 feet. Sixth order is small enough to look like a well-read cake stand. Between them, second, third, fourth, and fifth orders behave like siblings at a family reunion, similar, distinct, and very sure of their jobs. A first-order lens prefers capes and ocean headlands, places where weather keeps a diary. A fourth order is content on a river mouth with opinions about barges. The keeper knows each by feel. You don't so much walk around a first-order lens as orbit it. The steps are iron, usually in a spiral, that remember every shoe that has ever decided to be careful. The lantern room echoes in a way that makes even whispers sound like they have learned to tie their shoes. Because the beam must not only exist, but also introduce itself rhythmically, the lens often rides a carriage that turns with the slow confidence of a clock. Early arrangements floated the heavy frame in a trough of mercury, so the whole assembly could glide with 2 fingers. Later ones used ball bearings and virtue. A governor compass, sometimes called a fly, owned the job of maintaining the rate, because ships learn lights not by personality but by character. Flash, pause, flash, longer pause, repeat forever, the way a planet keeps an appointment. Charts publish these characteristics in small exact phrases. GPFL, 2.5S or ISO 6 South, that a watch officer reads as naturally as you read your own handwriting. Paint a lighthouse a thrilling color and sailors will be grateful. But give it the wrong flash interval and someone will file a letter. The clockwork that enforces this is a sculpture of gears and weights, a tall drum with a chain, and a mast that must be wound with a crank. The weight drops through the tower's center the way gravity likes to commute, and when it reaches the basement, the keeper winds it up again, having politely pretended the tower is a very practical grandfather clock. Daily life with a lens is a slow choreography of cleaning. Salt air prefers to sign its name on glass with invisible flourishes. Soot, when oil lamps were involved, arrives with opinions, and must be discouraged with a soft cloth and what old manuals call rouge-aine oxide that polishes gently. Keepers were instructed not to breathe too enthusiastically on prisms because breath makes friends with residue. They wore felt slippers in some services so the floor would not scratch and the lens would not pick up the faint drama of footsteps. Rules written in hand that will never be accused of whim advise against onions and fried foods in the lantern room, because certain aromas over time make a film that turns clarity into memory. Somewhere, a keeper's cookbook organizes itself around this ban without complaint. In the days of wick and mantle, The flame sat in a lamp made with more humility than a chandelier. The wick was often flat and wide, plated for steadiness, trimmed with scissors shaped like good intentions. A lampist, an expert, might visit once a year to adjust a burner that has grown philosophical. He would nod at the lens the way a piano tuner nods at a Steinway, then make 3 small changes that explain why night looks the way it does. The logbook is calm to the point of poetry. Weather, haze. Wind, SSW, force 3. Duties, usual. Occasional entries become tiny biographies. Lamp smoked on second watch trimmed and cleared. Mercury trough wiped and strained. Petrol found in gallery. Release toward east. Visitor party of 4, explain characteristic. A fog signal, which belongs to the same family but prefers to be heard rather than seen, keeps its own schedule in a shed below, exhaling with either a diaphone's patient BOO or a bell that insists on history. Keepers learn to sleep between the pulses. Families learn to time cooking to the moment. The weight reached the mid-landing so that someone was always winding or stirring or both. On winter nights in higher latitudes, the lamp burned for 18 hours, and the keeper understood endurance the way stone understands weather, by practicing. A microfact drifts in. The lens elements were sometimes shipped as crates of glass and assembled on site specifically for that tower, like a cathedral kit delivered by boat. Each prism received a number and a place, and a diagram less dramatic than a treasure map told how they fit. Screws held brass frames that held the prisms that held the beam, and if you loosened one thing, you had thoughts about all the things. Another microfact: some services floated the lens on a mercury bath, not because engineers love drama, but because a ton of glass actually turns with surprising ease that way. The keeper, after polishing, would test the rotation with his hand, and the assembly would move like a planet deciding to cooperate. You washed your hands twice after that chore, then once more just in case. The architecture made practical poetry. A lighthouse is a stair problem that learned to be vertical. Stone towers are thick at the base, then at the top, because gravity likes a taper. Iron towers are skeletal and particularly fond of swamps. Gallery decks accept wind like a compliment. Parapets are where you learn whether your hat is serious. Fresnel insisted on large panes in the lantern to minimize framing that interrupts light. Glaziers said yes, and then made a schedule for mending what storms misunderstood. The keepers learned which bolts adopt a taste for rust and which just look like it. Paint often white because sunlight treats it kindly and ships read it easily by day renews the tower. A sense of self the way sleep renews anybody's. Electricity arrived not as a rival but as a colleague who didn't require wick trimmers. Incandescent lamps sat where flames used to live, and later halogen, and then metal halide. Then LEDs that can look unreasonably efficient if you grew up with oil. The lens didn't mind. Light is light, and the prisms do their work with whoever shows up on time. Rotation moved from weights to motors. Governors turned to small electric regulators. The flash characteristics stayed because ships are sentimental about habits that keep them off rocks. Automation followed. In many places, the keeper's last duty was to teach a cabinet to do his job. He showed it the switch and the backup switch and the timer and the rule about sunrise being persuasive. Then he wrote "station automated" in a logbook that had never written that before, and he closed the door gently because goodbyes prefer that. If this is beginning to feel like a lullaby written for glass, that is because lenses like being described quietly, even their history whispers. August and Zhang Fresnel's work crossed over from wave theory to factory floor. Glasshouses learned to press concentric rings, and then to grind and polish with patience sold by the week. Lighthouse authorities, Trinity House in England, the Service Day fairs at Baylises in France. The U.S. Lighthouse Board and later service wrote standards that are beautiful only if you like paragraphs about thread pitch. I do. Someone had to decide how many bolts hold a door. and how tall the parapet must be, so a person looking out to judge visibility wanted to also test whether gravity means what it says. They decided. Keepers obeyed and then made rational exceptions when the weather pointed out a detail the paper had never visited. We can linger in commonplace heroics without raising the pulse. A keeper once discovered a cracked prism, not a catastrophe, more like a mood, and bound it with a strap until a new piece could come by steamer that waited for a tide that waited for a moon. Another keeper counting rotations overnight to ensure the flashes matched the book. Listened to the click of the escapement and found it steady enough to let thoughts wander to letters unwritten and lists. Half done, which is the mental pantry of the profession. On windy nights, when spray wrote its name across the glass and froze keepers used, scrapers designed for this moment to restore the world's view, then went back to their stools with the contentment of a task completed without applause. Visitors sometimes imagined loneliness and were rewarded with stew, conversation, and a brief seminar on witch shapes. Cats worked the station's rodent problem better than exhortations. Dogs elected themselves wave inspectors. Children learned the exact number of steps between kitchen and lantern room and bragged about it to cousins who lived in houses that didn't spiral. Charts are full of light spoken as numbers, and numbers make good company for sleep. FL 3:15:24M means a group of 3 flashes every 15 seconds and visible on a normal day for 24 miles, which is really 24 nautical miles or 44.5 kilometers, or the distance a small promise can travel if it keeps its feet dry. Isophase lights balance light and dark. Occulting lights give more light than dark. Fixed lights refuse to blink at all. Sectors show red or green through colored panes to warn a mariner that he has wandered into a story the shoals are telling. Keepers learn these the way shopkeepers learn prices by touch. A person could tell time at night by the rhythm of their own station if they were the sort who thinks in fractions while stirring soup. Occasionally, the lens retires. Museums inherit them, polish them with volunteer precision, and set them on pedestals where they can receive visitors without worrying about weather. People walk around the prisms as if orbiting a planet that doesn't mind. They ask how far the light went, and the guide says, "Farther than you would think for a lantern this size," which is a phrase that covers a century nicely. Somewhere a first-order lens lights only 3 or 4 times a year by appointment. Docents turn the motor. An amazed hum returns to the room, and the beams reach out and hit exhibits that never had expectations. The old mercury pans are emptied and displayed like basins that once trained clouds. Children count rings. Grandmothers read placards and discover the word catadioptric, which means prisms that both refract and reflect and sounds like a cat that learned optics. Modern beacons are practical to the point of shyness. LED panels arranged in arrays do their work free of rouge and slipper rules. Solar panels show up on catwalks and tilt like sunflowers with ambitions. Remote monitors phone into central computers and say things like lamp healthy, voltage fine, seagull opinion elevated. The system logs these lines in a file that nobody reads until a storm arrives to rearrange priorities. The sea, which is both audience and critic, accepts the new light as long as it keeps its appointments. Ships do not write thank you notes. They set courses and pass, trusting that the flash that says, "This place will be there again," after a count of seconds that have been measured by people who care for seconds. Last details drift like good drowsiness. Lantern glass, if not cleaned, can collect micro scratches that turn a beam into polite haze. This is why felt and patience are better than enthusiasm. Vent balls at the top of lanterns admit air without admitting weather, an argument with physics that ends amiably. In cold climates, stoves stood at the landing below the lantern, so that a keeper warming hands could also listen for irregular clicks from the escape. Wheel irregularity being a small alarm bell that asks for oil or adjustment or rarely a story. The wind lists its preferences on each station: north with needles here, south with goals there, and the building answers with a flex or a whistle that becomes a kind of lullaby. Paint dries slower than opinions. This is why lighthouses keep both schedules and ladders. If you're still listening, stand with me in the lantern after midnight. The rotation is steady. The prisms catch the lamp and release it, catch and release, like breathing. Each flash goes out, and some number of heartbeats later meets a ship that is nothing but a moving room and a person who has chosen to be awake. That person looks up, counts, and nods, and a pencil line on a chart becomes a course again. Below us, the weight descends another inch. In the logbook, a line is written that says everything and nothing, light exhibited as usual. The phrase has appeared on more pages than any epic, and it is better than an epic for sleeping, because as usual is the whole point of lights and most of the point of people. And if you are already half asleep, the lens will finish the night on your behalf, speaking in long even sentences of glass, telling the horizon, where the land decided to be careful in keeping that appointment, while the keeper's felt slippers wait by the door, ready for another round in a room that knows exactly how much light it owns. You might not expect the quiet revolution of the 20th century to be a flat rectangle of wood, but there it is, the palette. A humble wooden stage that taught boxes to travel as a chorus instead of soloist. Before pallets, cargo moved by, hand in a rhythm that sounded like grunting, counting, and dropping. Barrels rolled because they were round, crates shuffled because they were stubborn, and sacks developed personalities on rainy days. Then warehouses discovered that if you fasten a few boards together with a thoughtful gap, and let a machine slide its steel teeth underneath, gravity becomes cooperative. A skid came first, no bottom deck, just runners, and then the pallet, with two faces like a tidy sandwich that refuses to sag. If you're still awake when we reach the part about stamps burned into the wood like little passports, feel free to subscribe as gently as a forklift lowering a load at the end of a shift. If sleep arrives earlier, the pallet will be fine with that. Its genius is to work while everyone else is thinking about something else. The story steps forward slowly in warehouses that smelled of rope, oil, and sawdust. Early forklifts called tow motors in a tone that suggested fondness learned to raise things higher than people thought was sensible, and suddenly shelves could be tall instead of merely upright. World War II turned the pallet from a good idea into an inevitability. You cannot load ships for distant oceans one crate at a time without learning to stack courageously. Pallets taught soldiers rations, tires, and ammunition to move in disciplined squares, and when the war ended, the habit stayed the way efficient habits do. The unit load was born, goods plus pallet, plus wrapping, plus optimism, all behaving as if they were one dignified object. Somewhere a clerk wrote one pallet on a form and felt a private joy because counting by ones is easier when each one is 40 cases of soup. Pallets came in many accents because every country had an opinion about what rectangles should look like, but the rhythm was the same. Top deck boards, bottom deck boards, stringers or blocks between, nails that understood they would never be famous, and 2 or 4 forklift entries, depending on whether patience or access had won the argument that day, dot stand quietly in a grocery distribution center, and you can see the grid that won. In North America, the General Merchandise Association blessed a size 48 by 40 inches, a proportion that suits milk crates and breakfast cereal, and the world's idea of a highway trailer. Europe preferred the Euro pallet, 1200 by 800 millimeters, a difference that looks small to the eye and large to a conveyor. ISO later shook hands with everyone and published a family of sizes so a planet could pretend to coordinate. Pallets themselves grew personalities. Stringer pallets had 3 long numbers running front to back. Block pallets used 9 blocks, like small wooden cities to lift the top deck, allowing forks in from all 4 sides. which machines appreciate the way cats appreciate a second door. Deck boards developed chamfers on their edges, so steel blades would glide instead of negotiate. The lead board, the first to meet a forklift, often wore a thicker confidence. The center boards did not mind being ordinary. Nails were not just nails, but annular ring shanks that bite wood the way a promise bites memory. You could look at the underside and read the story of a carpenter's jig, a nailer's afternoon, a mill's temper. Moisture content mattered because wet wood equals heavy. Promises. Many services dried boards to about 19%, so shrinkage would happen at home rather than on the truck dot. At first glance, the pallet looks like a platform, but it is really a passport office. Nearly every export pallet carries a small rectangular brand burned into the wood, an IPPC mark for ISPM 15, a standard whose title is longer than its stamp. Those initials mean the wood has been politely educated against insects heat-treated, mostly until the core reaches a temperature the beetles find inhospitable. Once upon a time, methyl bromide fumigation did the job. The chemical retired with. Mixed reviews and the world leaned into heat. The stamp includes a country code, a registration number, and the letters HT as calmly as you might write slept 8 hours. Inspectors at ports read these brands the way librarians read call. Numbers, no drama, just permission. Pallets sometimes carry other symbols too. A recycled mark, a pool company logo, a property warning that says return to us with varying degrees of patience. CHEP's blue paint turned whole supply chains into shades of ocean. Other pools chose red or gray and insisted, with dry humor, that paint is not a suggestion. A pallet can live a long life in this bureaucracy, traveling by train, truck, and idle rumor. When it retires, it may become a planter, a coffee table, or the structural member of a dorm room loft. Do-it-yourself videos have made more furniture out of pallets than some furniture companies. Although the nails always have opinions about that. You might think wood is the whole story until plastic enters. Quotations around the word hygienic. Plastic pallets nest or rack without splinters, appreciate being washed, and do not develop moods in rain. They are more expensive to buy and less expensive to argue with in a freezer. Still pallets exist where sparks are welcome guests. Aluminum rides airplanes because aluminum likes to pose with airplanes. Fiberboard slip sheets even try to replace pallets entirely, asking forklifts to grow thin lips called push-pull attachments so loads can be dragged with a reasonable dignity. The sheets weigh almost nothing and save on shipping, which makes accountants hum. But wood remains the majority species because trees understand how to become rectangles at scale. A mill cuts deck boards from economical widths. The stringers, or blocks, come from whatever the sawyer's day allowed. A nailer nowadays, often an automated line that never forgets the pattern stitches. The pieces into a unit that can carry 1,000 kilograms on a good afternoon. Static load ratings tell you what a pallet can tolerate while doing nothing. Dynamic ratings explain what happens when a forklift decides to dance. Rack ratings speak for the lonely strength required when a pallet sits between two beams and pretends not to notice gravity's outline. The secret life of pallets is mostly choreography. A warehouse manager opens a computer and decides how 80 cases of laundry detergent will arrange themselves so they do not fall asleep during a turn. Pallet patterns are a quiet art, column stacked. Loads are strong and like to go straight up. Interlocked patterns resist shifting and accept the idea that geometry sometimes wants friendship more than strength. Stretch wrap joins this with a thin, persuasive hug that shines just enough under fluorescent lights to admit it is there. Corner boards add dignity to edges. Top sheets keep dust from writing its name on candy. Dunnage fills private gaps. A tester somewhere, perhaps at a university lab, that knows the exact weight of a shrunk drops. a loaded pallet from small heights and measures how much it chooses to care. Vibration tables shake pallets until the bottles chime in chorus. Tilt. Tables instruct them gently about the limits of angle. It is all very polite and takes hours, and the results go into a binder that a forklift will never read but will obey. If you stand near the shipping doors at midday, you can watch the grid translate into traffic. Pallets ride straight onto trailers and then park themselves in snug little rows the way Tetris imagines architecture. Floor loading without pallets still exists where labor is cheap or the goods are odd, but the rectangle has become the default. Personality of freight. A 40-foot container can accept a tidy army of North American pallets or a different tidy army of Euro pallets with different accents. Spacers and good humor solve the rest. Pallet jacks, which are forklifts that decided to live near the floor, whisper across concrete with tiny whales that know all the warehouse's secrets. The jack's forks slip into the pallet with a sound that resembles confidence. 1 pump, 2 pumps, 3, and suddenly 1,000 pounds believes in casters. In the corner, a repair bench makes decisions. Broken deckboard, replace. Split stringer, add a companion and a metal strap and tell it to go gently. A repaired pallet carries 2 histories, the original build and the shop signature. Recyclers sort them by color, dimensions, and intention, and then send them out again. Like teachers who never tire of roll call, pallet pools behave like libraries for rectangles. A manufacturer needs pallets, but not forever. A pool provides. Them collects them back from retailers, inspects, repairs, and reissues, charging rent the way gravity charges attention. Exchange systems, by contrast, expect a pallet to be swapped for one of equal virtue at the destination, a theory that produces glorious spreadsheets and occasional stand-up comedy at the dock when equal virtue turns out to be more rhetorical than literal. Some industries avoid the argument entirely by staying closed loop. A beverage plant sends pallets to a bottler and gets the same ones back, as predictable as a favorite cup on the kitchen shelf. Automatic storage and retrieval systems, those tall mechanized libraries for things, ask pallets to behave within tighter tolerances. Boards must be straight, nails must shy away from protrusion, and skew is left outside like an umbrella. Robots that depalletize cases watch the stack with structured light and decide which box to lift next as calmly as a librarian sorting overdue notices. There are small, satisfying standards everywhere. A chamfer's angle is agreed upon in a paragraph that nobody quotes aloud. The distance between nails keeps the wood from splitting because somebody, years ago, split a lot of boards and wrote down the number that hurt least. Deckboard spacing respects the foot of a carton and the shoe of a warehouseman. The stringer notch for 4-way entry is sized so forks can enter without announcing themselves with a crash. Every choice adds seconds to a lifetime of loading and subtracts injuries that would have become stories. Even the smell of pallets is practical. Pine and oak and a hint of dust. The scent of forests agreeing to become furniture you never sit. Out back, a grinder turns the ones too tired for duty into mulch. Animal bedding or the next day's smoke for a neighborhood barbecue. Nothing is completely wasted in a system that knows how to loop. The modern twist is quiet as modern. Twists should be. Sensors slide into deck boards and report temperatures and shocks the way a travel diary reports snaps. Refit tags let gates count without looking up. Barcodes do the same for less money and more ink. A smart palette sounds ambitious until you realize its primary function is to confess its location honestly, which is all most relationships need. Pallet pulling apps match empties to needs the way ride-sharing apps match drivers to riders, only with fewer playlists. Sustainability departments put pallets into carbon spreadsheets, and the numbers behave as nicely as wood allows. A research. group models the cube utilization of a trailer and discovers that one more row of smaller pallets beats fewer larger ones for a particular cereal because box flaps have feelings about curvature. The meeting ends with a cookie and a new loading diagram. Out on the floor, a driver with 20 years experience looks at the same diagram and nods, because sometimes algebra catches up with gut.imagine as the lights dim toward closing. A last pallet sitting near the door with its stretch wrap, trimmed neatly and its label square as an oath. The manifest says 840 kilograms of ordinary, and the ordinary is exactly what is beautiful here. A jack slides underneath, a door rolls up, and the rectangle glides forward into an evening that barely notices. In the morning, it will be a step stool, a mini stage, a rolling platform, a bit of reusable geometry that disappears under the very things it enables. If pallets vanished for a day, packages would remember their old, clumsy selves. If they vanished for a week, grocery stores would learn the word empty in a new tense. But they do not vanish. They wait their turn, carry their load, accept a stamp, trade a bruise for a repair, and return to the grid. If you're already half asleep, that's appropriate. The pallet is a lullaby of logistics, a flat promise that lets the world stack its intentions and move them without fuss, then set them down again as softly as a yawn. You might not expect 6 tiny beeps to have a personality, but the time signal known as the pips has moods, anniversaries, and a surprisingly busy social calendar for something that lasts 5 seconds on the radio. They arrive with the confidence of a metronome that teaches clocks how to behave. 5 short tones and 1 long, a polite procession that says, in the most British way possible, now. The first time you notice them is a little like noticing your own breathing, so ordinary you're startled. It's been there all along. If you're still awake by the time we get to the night, the pips acquired an extra pip and nobody panicked. Feel free to subscribe as quietly as a wristwatch turning over at midnight. If sleep comes sooner, the beeps will continue without you. Because they were invented to be on time even when no one is looking, the idea of broadcasting time began at a window where astronomers watched the sky and then decided to phone the world. At Greenwich, long before radio became a room you could carry, the Rail Observatory determined noon by the sun and passed it to the city with a dropping ball, a literal red sphere that fell down a mast each day so ships on the Thames could set their chronometers by eyesight. A ball descending is not a beep, but it is the same kind of sentence. Telegraph wires soon pulled that sentence inland, a line of electric certainty, delivered from observatory to railways that liked their trains in the same minute as their timetables. The 19th century treated timekeeping like infrastructure. You could build with it, and people did. When radio arrived, the new trick was not just to know the time, but to agree on it in rooms that had never met. In 1924, the BBC and the observatory decided to make an appointment with everyone at once, and the time signal was born. The first beeps were not yet famous. They were simple clicks generated by a mechanical contact in Greenwich, passed down the line as if time were a neighbor bringing soup. A presenter, who probably wore more tie than necessary, would say the Greenwich time signal, and then there it was, 5 little dots and 1 final dash, like Morse code tidied up and put in evening clothes. The tones, in their modern form, are fixed notes at 1 kilohertz, a steady high sound that doesn't argue with static. They sound short because they are. Each of the first 5 lasts 1/10 of a second. The last one holds for half a second and lands precisely at the top of the minute. That final long tone is the handshake. The others are the clearing of the throat. Engineers built lovely contraptions to make them happen on time. Originally, the pulses came straight from an observatory pendulum whose manners were impeccable. Later, they were synthesized from atomic clocks that consider pendulums endearing but a little rustic. and then distributed through circuits that measured their own delays with a candor most humans avoid. Presenters learned to hold their breath. In the second before the pips, because nothing feels longer than 6 syllables trying to share a doorway with a metronome. If a program was running late, the producer would murmur, "Fill to the pips," and someone would tell a story with an ending you could place like a vase, neither too early nor too late. The pips were so reliable that mistakes around them became stories. Once a studio fed them through a line that added a small delay, clocks set by those pips became briefly shy. Everyone forgave the line and kept the pips. There is a quirk hidden in the beeps that keeps engineers alert the way cats stay alert to sacks of food. Most minutes contain 60 seconds because that's what minutes like to do. That the Earth is an eccentric spinner and occasionally needs a leap second to keep civil time near astronomical time. On such evenings, a minute holds 61 seconds, like a pocket that suddenly remembers another coin. The pips accommodate this by adding an extra short tone before the long one, so you get a sequence that sounds familiar but contains a secret. People who knew to listen smiled. People who didn't know still set their watches and were none the poorer. There were also the years when the leap second came at the end of June, just to keep summer punctual. A sleepy nation went to bed one second later and nothing burned, which is the kind of triumph the world rarely headlines. Meanwhile, daylight saving moved the clocks by an hour twice a year with a theatrical confidence. And the pips grinned because they cared for seconds. Not opinions. The speaking clock is a cousin to the pips, the sort of relative who phones rather than visits. In the United Kingdom, you could dial a 3-digit number once it was TIM, which already sounds reassuring, and hear a measured voice say, at the third stroke, the time will be, followed by beeps that sounded exactly like an appliance. Doing its best. The first voice, in the 1930s, belonged to a telephone operator whose vowels could iron trousers. Her name was Jane Kane. Later came Pat Simmons, politely immortal. Then Brian Cobby, whose delivery carried just enough brass to sound official without waking a baby. Then Sarah Mendes da Costa, warm and calm. Other countries had their own speaking clocks, and they all learned the rhythm that turns numbers into sentences you can pour into a cup. The early machines were mechanical, with rotating glass discs and photocells reading steps of time like a player piano that decided to talk. Engineers built cabinets that looked like sensible wardrobes and filled them with light and precision, and a human voice stored in a circle. When you called, relays clicked. A lamp winked to a stencil for the hours, another for the minutes, another for the seconds, and the line returned a sentence as inevitable as boiling water. Later systems went electronic and digital. The sentence remained. In staff rooms, operators told newcomers what callers sometimes asked. "Could you tell me when it's my birthday?" A small voice once said, "The time of the third stroke will be your birthday," the operator replied, and there was, for a moment, no need for technology at all. Dot studios grew their own habits around the beeps. Wall clocks with minute hands that jumped rather than swept gave producers small heart attacks. Models with a continuous sweep taught them to glide. Red tally lights glowed above microphones like cherries that only ripen at 0. Newsreaders folded scripts so the last line could be read while the pips approached, without anyone seeing panic. "Time now," a presenter would say, using a phrase that contains its own ceiling. In the control room, a digital clock counted down. 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 3 seconds became a kind of prayer. When the long tone finished, a headline began with the soft click of a fader, and a breath held a little longer than usual. The shipping forecast, with its litany of sea areas and wind forces, often kissed the pips on the cheek and stepped aside. Some were a trawler set a course accordingly. In school corridors, Caretakers set electric clocks by the radio once a week and turned the key that synchronized. 100 classrooms at once. Chalk dust and punctuality shared the air. There were mishaps worth smiling at and none worth worrying about. Once, a presenter beat the pips with a goodbye, said sorry on the first beep, and then not at all on the second, because professionalism can be corrected by physics. Another time, the pips stopped mid-sequence when a fault tripped. You could imagine confetti falling in the control room as engineers threw switches that prefer choreography to surprise. Artists occasionally sampled the pips for music. The beeps held tempo as if they had always wanted a nightclub. A novelty competition asked listeners to guess how many pips had been broadcast in the service's lifetime. The answer was a number large enough to make 0 feel like an exotic cousin. There were false pips, too, tones used internally to line up feeds that somehow escaped on air and caused no more harm than a rehearsal heard through a keyhole. The audience, being fond, let them pass. If you look at the pips long enough and they invite it, you discover they are really a gateway to the way a society decides to be together. Timekeeping is method dressed as comfort. Trains leaving on time use it to prevent arguments. Surgery starting on time uses it to prevent anything more serious. Bank clocks that blink 12 o'clock after a power cut betray how much they envied the radio. Computer networks now fold time into packets, network time protocol, which sounds like a law and behaves like a butler. GPS spits out time as if it were confetti. Your phone, which has never met Greenwich, knows its seconds with impractical confidence by listening to satellites whose orbits are corrected for relativity, a sentence as sleepy as it is astonishing. Yet the pips persist, not because instruments need them, but because ears like them. A beep does not ask to be believed. It asks to be heard. People still set kitchen timers by radio noon. A bus driver still checks his wrist against a long tone. A child still whispers now, along with the final beep, and then watches the minute flip on a display that pretends to be old. The technology under all this has the kindness of over-engineering. The tones are scheduled by computers locked to atomic standards. They are injected into studio feeds with timestamped packets that announce their latency and ask to be treated with respect. On digital radios and internet streams, delays of a few seconds appear, and the pips become more like a postcard than a handshake. Engineers sigh and publish notes explaining why this is normal, and listeners do what they have always done. They use the nearest clock that agrees with them. In remote transmitters, cabinets keep time with oscillators that hold their breath between synchronizations. Backup generators rehearse. At some sites, an old mechanical clock still ticks on a wall, out of habit and retains the authority of furniture. The long sweep second hand leans into the 12 like a runner finishing a lap. The pips, arriving fractionally later on IP feeds, cheer from the stands and insist the lap counts anyway. There is a quiet theater to the leap second nights. On those evenings, the studio clock shows DYY, a number that looks like an in-joke until you realize it is merely honest. The extra pip arrives, and the long one waits its moment as if saving a seat. Newsreaders with decades of experience nod at the clock with a familiarity usually reserved for pets. Somewhere an astronomer raises an eyebrow at the Earth's wobble and writes another paper. Somewhere a database administrator tightens a script and makes coffee. At sea, nothing special happens at all, which is the point. The horizon stays put. The stars continue their quiet rehearsals, and the radio sends a beep that admits it is aware of the planet's compromises. We can drift now toward the speaking clock's afterlife. Most people stop dialing it when phones found their own time in orbit, but the number lingers the way a favorite shop lingers even after you learn to bake. On anniversaries, the service hires a charity voice for a season, and the sentence changes tone but not words. Children still discover it by accident and report back that a grown-up on the telephone knows what minute it is without asking. In museums, one of the old mechanical units has been restored and sits behind glass like a jukebox for punctuality. Curators press a button and you can hear the relays chatter and the lamps glow through the numerals, and then the phrase, "at the third stroke," spoken by a disc as smooth as a long, calm exhale. Across the room, a case holds the handset used by operators to test lines. Even the cord looks precise dot, and then it is night, and the radio is low, and somewhere a presenter is filling to the pips again. Outside, streetlights draw their own dotted lines down a road that knows how to arrive. The beeps come, 5 short and 1 long, and they land with the satisfying precision of a drawer-closing flush. You could set a watch by them, although your watch already knows. The point may no longer be accuracy. The point may be ceremony. For 5 seconds, the nation shares the same punctuation mark. The sentence that follows, news, weather, the shipping forecast, a song, is easier to hear when it has a clean beginning. If you've drifted off, the pips will keep happening without you. They don't mind. They were invented for exactly this, to tell time to people who may or may not be listening, and to make the top of the minute feel briefly like the top of something larger, a quiet that includes your breathing, and a voice that has learned, after a century, how to start again. You might not expect the quietest morning in a remote Siberian forest to decide anything important, but on one June day in 1908, it did the loudest thing it could think of without leaving a note. It began with a bright smear in the northeastern sky, a line so white the herders looked up and squinted at the idea of day arriving twice. Birds paused. Docs explained themselves to no one. A man in a hut rose from his bed because the sun felt too eager. He stepped outside and saw a fire that had learned how to travel. A few minutes later, the world's most decisive heir arrived. Trees bowed as if rehearsed. Windows in villages far enough away to consider themselves private rattled their memories out onto the floor. If you're still awake when we get to the telegram that described the end of the world, feel free to subscribe with the same energy as a falling pine deciding to lie perfectly still. Or don't. This is a gentle program. And the forest has already done most of the work. People tried to describe the light and ran out of everyday words very quickly. In Awinki camps, hunters stared at the sky until their eyes watered, and then told the same tale in slightly different hats. A blue-white cylinder moving east to north, a new sun that forgot its manners, a tail like hot linen. A trading post keeper opened his door at breakfast and discovered that breakfast had developed a halo. A station master watched 2 shadows stand at once and made a note that sounded like philosophy. Far away, in places that would never meet Siberia on purpose, gauges twitched. Seismographs in Europe sketched a faint earthquake on paper drums. Barometers sulked at their needles for an hour. A British newspaper later reported night skies so bright that readers claimed they could check their garden tools at midnight without pretending. A photograph taken in London that evening looks as if the city had borrowed a polar twilight and failed to return it on time. If you want a microfact to put in your pocket, try this. For days, little clouds high in the atmosphere shimmered like cautious silk, the first widespread accounts of noctilucent clouds, which are the sky's way of saying it will sometimes keep secrets about where the dust came from. The bang itself did not leave a tidy calling card. Instead of a crater, the forest offered geometry. 80 million trees, give or take a large number that doesn't mind, way flattened in a radial pattern like a map drawn by a compass with very strong opinions. Near the center, trees stood upright, stripped bare like polite flagpoles, as if the shock wave had gone down first and then sideways and then lost interest. People who walked the site years later said it smelled of resin and old thunder. Reindeer herds vanished in an instant because a blast wave does not negotiate with antlers. Herdsmen suffered burns on faces, turned toward the light, and were spared. On the opposite side, which feels like a grant proposal from physics, houses did what houses do when the air forgets it is gentle. They fell down and then argued about which wall had started it. In trading posts, shards of glass learned how to become confetti. An eyewitness reported that the heat felt like someone had opened an oven the size of the day. Another swore he saw the sky split and then knit itself again, which is not how knitting works, but is exactly how a terrified sentence sounds. Curious thing about remote catastrophes is how they move slowly through paperwork. The news trickled by rail, by rumor, by officials who made lists because lists are better than panic. Russia had other problems, and only a few scientists wanted to spend weeks on horseback to find a thing that might not want to be found. Almost 20 years, the map kept a polite blank where an explanation should be. Then a school teacher turned self-appointed explorer, Leonid Kulik, persuaded a museum that a great meteorite had fallen and that he would bring back the proof. He traveled. He asked directions from people who had learned not to hurry. He reached the flattening and drew circles on a notebook so large it would need winter to finish. He expected a crater the size of a confession. He found, instead, absence. No hole, no obvious fragments. Only trees behaving as if a giant had exhaled. This is the sort of negative evidence that makes a scientist rub his forehead and then stay for another month. From here, the patient part of the story begins. The part with theories that refuse to tidy themselves. One group said meteor. Another said comet. Both agreed something from space met something from air and manners were not observed. A stony asteroid, perhaps 50 meters across, could have entered at a shallow angle and exploded mid-air like an argument, releasing energy on the order of many megatons, which is a way of admitting the forest had hosted a brief misunderstanding. Usually reserved for stars, a cometary nucleus, dust, and the ambition to be temporary could also fit, the vaporization leaving little in the way of fragments. Each theory came with lovely proportional diagrams and calm labels like center of devastation, as if the trees might attend a meeting. Kulik searched for iron and found peat enriched with little spherules, metal beads that might have been forever melted and then cooled in a hurry. Later expeditions found more spherules, most of them ordinary minerals, suddenly interesting because of their address. Nobody found a crater unless you count pawns that decided to look suspicious only after being asked dot in the polite queue of explanations. There were delightful tangents. A silicate body rich in olivine, they said, might disintegrate before touching anything important. A carbonaceous chondrite would leave a different fingerprint, one that might smudge more easily in bogs. Some suggested a stony core sheathed in volatiles that turned to gas and carried its own shrapnel away like an amateur magician. Models showed shock fronts folding like blankets, thermal fluxes racing ahead like gossipy light, and a turbulent wake that scoured the topsoil until it believed in the sky. If this sounds like a lullaby written by a physics textbook, it is. The equations are tidy and the forest was not, and that mismatch is the sort of thing that keeps conferences happily awake and normal people happily asleep. Of course, the century could not resist making the mystery earn its keep. UFO enthusiasts adopted Tunguska the way cats adopt laps, decisively and as if it had always been theirs. Some said a craft exploded, though why a vehicle clever enough to cross light years would forget to break in. Siberia remains an open question even on friendly nights. Others drafted a small black hole on the chalkboard, a guess that would have burrowed through the earth with all the ceremony of a needle through an apple, leaving a track we did not see because the planet, being polite, healed. There was an antimatter spaceship. There was Nikola Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower aiming an experiment accidentally at the wrong forest. As if inspiration had a poor sense of direction, each tale arrived with a voice that knew how to wink. Each ignored the simple arithmetic of shock waves because arithmetic is less fun at parties. The charm of these ideas is that they give the forest a cast. The weakness is that they ask for more miracles than the trees ever admitted to seeing. Because the blast occurred under an empire that cultivated paperwork like a crop, claims of a cover-up have also found employment. Why the delay, people ask, between 1908 and Calic's expedition? The answer is the 30 words no conspiracy. Enjoys. Distance, swamps, winter, revolution, budgets, and the fact that horse travel does not run on curiosity alone. Some add that the Soviet state later discouraged lively talk about cosmic rocks because such rocks do not respect borders and therefore make poor citizens. There are memos, there are gaps, and there are historians who shrug and point out that large countries routinely misplace details even when no one asks them to. The remains of later Soviet weapons programs, of course, leave their own shadows on the map, and it is not difficult to imagine a paperwork-scented path from Mystery Blast to Please Stop Mentioning That. But the trees, being retired from politics, offer no testimony besides their compass roses on the ground. And the peat layers keep quiet the way peat layers do. The careful explanations have matured like wine, cellared in weatherproof halls. In the 1990s and 2000s, teams modeled atmospheric entry with computers that like fire but not drama. A body 30 to 60 meters across, entering at maybe 20 kilometers per second, meets thicker air and discovers that air can behave like rock if you insist. Dynamic pressure exceeds a material strength you can write on a board. Fragmentation occurs, energy dumps faster than heat can mind its manners, and a fireball forms whose expansion is less a ball than a flower with opinions. The shockwave arrives at the forest like a messenger who refuses to knock. Ground-level thermal radiation may ignite tinder. Trunks scorch on the side that looked at the sky and remain pale on the side that did not. The absence of a crater is no longer a puzzle, but the point. If the disintegration is high enough, all you get is bruised air and geometry below. People have even tried to work backward from treefall patterns to solve for entry direction and angle, the way you might reconstruct a wind from the angle of Sleeper's hair. The answers cluster around northwest to southeast, shallowish, with enough spread to grant anyone a satisfying graph. Legends, meanwhile, keep their slippers by the door. Some Iwenki stories speak of the god Okti sending punishment, a fiery guest that teaches respect the way gods prefer to teach. A few tales remember a thunderbird the size of courage. Others fold the event into an older vocabulary of sky messengers and exchanged favors. Modern documentaries retell these with music that believes in drums. Scientists who, like truths that can be weighed, still listen, because any account that says, "I saw the sky split," is a data point even when the verb is poetic. There were also reports of a man knocked from his chair by a wave of air and found later with the house shifted, and the tea still unsipped. Another said he felt heat on his cheek as if the day had inhaled across a stove. Small facts, like the magnetic storm recorded after, have participated in more than one debate. Was it geomagnetic? Was it local ionization? Was it an instrument that chose drama? The answer varies depending on which afternoon you ask if Tunguska happened today. We would collect it like a hobby. Seismometers would register the airwave moving at the speed of sound and then slower as it crawled around the world. Infrasound stations would etch it into the day, the way whales etch their voices into oceans. Satellites would photograph the fireball in several wavelengths, one of which would make clouds look like dignified handkerchiefs. Dashcams would capture it from a dozen angles. The internet would collate before lunchtime. Meteorologists would go on television and explain dynamic pressure with grace. Emergency services would practice evacuation and then perhaps not need it. Someone would write thread on Tunguska physics and attach diagrams that behave better than comments. Another person would offer a conspiracy and be rewarded with follows in a polite disagreement. Within hours, teams would ask for a research aircraft, and within weeks, a field camp would bloom with tents that keep secrets as well as they keep mosquitoes out. A small rover might crawl among the fallen trunks and discover they smelled the same in 2025 as they did in 1908 of sap and heat that were tired there. Insurance companies would discover new forms. Someone would sell t-shirts. The forest would wait for lichen to return like an apology. What remains, after all the models and the jokes and the stampings of documents, is a pleasant humility. Earth is large enough to host an airburst that knocks trees flat over a map as wide as a small country, and small enough that we discovered it in the diaries of reindeer herders and the complaints of broken windows. The event sits near the boundary between the frequent and the rare, large enough to arrive once in a few human lifetimes, small enough to leave mostly polite damage if it chooses a wilderness rather than a city. Planetary defense planners like to explain that telescopes now keep an eye on rocks with a cadence that would have made Kulik very sleepy. Survey catalogs have names like reassurance. Sky surveys collect fate points, calculate orbits, and color code them like teacher's notes. For objects the size that would make another Tunguska, we are learning to notice sooner and to shrug later. There is talk of deflection, of kinetic impactors that nudge politely, of gravity tractors that hover and persuade, of early warning networks that translate light into advice. Quietly, cities practice. Quietly, school children learn about meteors, with crayons that will someday be recycled. Quietly, the sky continues. We can let the scene drain now and listen to the slow sound of regrowth. The flattened forest recovered itself with the stubbornness of green things. Saplings took their turn, then taller cousins. The pattern of destruction softened till new patterns, the sort birds prefer, returned. The peat continued its patient job of keeping years in order. In summer, mosquitoes did what mosquitoes do, untroubled by cosmic narratives. A scientist sat on a log and ate a sandwich, while a colleague measured tree rings as if they were unrolling. Tape. In a museum thousands of kilometers away, a glass case holds tiny spherules that look like nothing in particular to a sleepy visitor, and that is their gift. The universe is very good at disguising its fire as sand. Another researcher models shock-front interactions and prints a graph that resembles a sleepy mountain range. She pins it to a wall, labels the axes in neat handwriting, and goes home before dark. In classrooms, the story lands as a paragraph between two more famous paragraphs and does not mind. Even the place name softens at the edges. Tunguska, a word that sounds like a yawn beginning. Night in the forest now looks like any night. The sky that once startled the world goes about its quiet work of frost and faint breezes. A herder ties a line and does not think about dynamic pressure. A geophysicist somewhere notices a small wiggle on a seismogram and, without drama, labels it wind. The world that heard a bang and then took a breath has returned to the business of seasons. If you have drifted, let the drift continue. The great absence of a crater is friendly to sleep. The scattered spherules are somewhere under moss, harmless, as confetti after the parade. The memory of the air turning to a hand is, at this hour, only a slow page in a quiet book. And if the sky ever decides to rehearse again, we will do what we always do. Look up, listen, write it down, and then make tea that cools on the table while the earth turns with its usual good manners, as if nothing unusual had happened, and also as if everything unusual were perfectly normal. You might not expect a rectangle to have a party trick, but the most successful rectangle on Earth can be cut in half and still look like itself. That small mathematical magic is the heartbeat of A-series paper, and once you notice it, you start seeing a 4 as a quiet acrobat that folds, halves, and copies without changing its face. You pick up a sheet and it already knows how to become two smaller versions of itself again and again, like a polite set of nesting dolls that refuse to roll away. If you're still awake by the time we reach the envelope that is designed specifically to give a 4 a proper code, you can subscribe as gently as placing a page into a folder. Or don't. Nothing here is urgent. The page will wait. It has spent a century doing exactly that. The story begins in rooms dusted with fiber and resin, where early paper makers pulled wet pulp on wire screens and hoped for rectangles that were more or less rectangular. Medieval chancery sizes wandered. Foolscap strutted around with a cap and bell's name and no commitment to consistent hem lengths. Printers measured with thumbs, with picas, with the unwavering confidence of men who owned. Rulers. Somewhere, mathematicians were quietly rooting for a rectangle that could reproduce by halving without changing its proportions. The ratio they liked was the square root of 2 to 1, because having that shape gives two daughters just like their mother, which is both adorable and extremely convenient for cabinets. The German physicist Georg Christoph Lichtenberg pointed this out in the 18th century with the satisfaction of a man who has discovered tidy symmetry hiding in plain sight. Paper, however, took its time to listen. Offices kept stacks of almost but not quite compatible sheets, and clerks learned the noble art of trimming dot. Then the 20th century put on its tidy hat. In 1922, Germany published a standard called DIN 476 and announced that a series would be the official way for rectangles to occupy desks. The starting sheet AO would possess an area of exactly 1 square meter, a decision that pleased both engineers and anyone who enjoys a round number pretending to be a square. From an O, you could fold along the long side and obtain a 1, then a 2, then a 3, and eventually a 4, which found its destiny as letter paper, meeting minutes, and the surface where doodles grow during long calls. There is a patient beauty to the math. The sides of a series sheets are always in the ratio 1, 2. That means the long side divided by the short side is the same as the short side divided by half the long side, which is the sort of sentence that puts pillows to excellent use. The practical result is better than poetry. Enlargement and reduction on a copier become mindless, margins behave, drawings scale without sour surprises. AO is big enough to be a map. A4 is friendly. A5 is a notebook that believes in cafes. This is the moment when the paper learns to speak in grams. Weight at last becomes a property of area rather than mood. Grammage grams per square meter, or GSM, tells you not how heavy the sheet feels today, but how heavy every square meter of it will always be. 80 GSM is the everyday office citizen. 120 GSM feels important without becoming theatrical. Cardstock wanders up into 200 GSM, where it begins to suspect it might become a postcard and travel. Once you set the area at 1 square meter for AO, the math makes the rest easy. A1 is half a square meter, a 2 a quarter, a 3 an eighth, a 4 a 16th. If the ream of a 4 you buy says 80 GSM, you can calculate with only the softest enthusiasm how much the stack should weigh. It will be close, and you will feel trustworthy for no particular reason other than that the universe has let you. Convert a shelf into arithmetic dot paper does not travel alone. It likes companions that fit. The B series was introduced as a diplomatic buffer between A sizes, used for posters and passports and anything that likes a little breathing room. The C series was designed for envelopes, a gallery of tailored coats. For the A family, fold an A4 once to a 5, then it will slip neatly into a C5 envelope. Keep a 4 unfolded, and the C4 envelope will accept it with the paternal calm of something made exactly for that duty. If you need to mail an A4 that has been folded, twice like a polite letter, C6 handles it without argument. This is not romance. It is choreography. Offices began to experience the peculiar pleasure of having shelves that agreed with drawers, that agreed with envelopes, that agreed with postal rates. Somewhere in a ministry, a procurement officer smiled for an entire afternoon, and nobody knew. Why? The square root of 2 property is such a small trick and such a large convenience that once you feel it, you cannot imagine living without it. Fold an A4 lengthwise and you get a 5 with the same aspect ratio. Place 2 A4 south side by side and an A3 grins back at you. Architects love this. If a drawing started on a 1, a reduced copy on a 3 would have exactly the same proportions, simply smaller. Printers loved it because presses could be planned around predictable impositions. Teachers loved it because worksheets could be enlarged without a border tantrum. Even photocopiers, which are machines that thrive on being taken for granted, loved it because their zoom buttons could have sensible settings. 141% takes a 4 to a 3. 71% returns, and anyone who knows those 2 numbers feels like a member of a small, very calm club. Adoption spread with the quiet persistence of a filing cabinet moving into a new office. Europe standardized. Japan took to it with graceful precision and named A4 in catalogs that make measurement look romantic. Much of the world followed. A 4 became the letter that didn't need a stamp to explain itself. But in North America, the past made a comfortable nest and stayed there. The famous letter size, 8.5 by 11 inches, had emerged from traditions of cutting larger sheets into useful children with sizes named demi and ledger and government, and from the physical reach of a papermaker's arm at the vat, which is not an SI unit but once made sense. People grew attached to it the way you grow attached to a jacket that fits even though its buttons are eccentric. Printers, cabinets, and 3-ring binders pledged allegiance to 8.5 times 11 and were indifferent to arguments about the loveliness of square root 2. The result is a cultural border made of fiber. One world uses a rectangle that halves into itself. Another uses one that halved becomes something charmingly different. Neither side, it must be said, loses sleep over this. Along the way, paper accumulated tiny customs. The Swiss fold for brochures kept text in an order that allowed a reveal as gentle as opening a curtain. Margin conventions, 2 centimeters. On 3 sides, 3 on the binding side gave editors space to sigh in red pencil. Hole punching became regional dialect. 2 holes in continental Europe lined up with filing pens stout as resolve. 4 holes, favored in some offices, distributed. Stress like good management. The United Kingdom's practical compromise of 2 plus 2 for universality made binders that looked like they had opinions. In North America, the 3-ring binder, an invention whose click is a minor rite of passage harmonized with 8.5. Times 11 like 2 old friends discussing weather. Staplers learned to crimp in 2 moods. The permanent bite and the temporary pen that lets you remove pages later without confessing a mistake. Even the little anvil you twist on a stapler is a detail. That feels like housekeeping becoming art. Copiers arrived and built their empire atop these rectangles. An automatic document feeder could be trusted to chew A4 all day without asking for praise. Sensors and trays learned to feel the difference between a 3 and a 4 so the machine could say wrong size in a tone that sounded almost human. Fax machines traveled over phone lines at 9,600 baud and then 14,400, turning a 4 into sound and back into paper on the other side of the world with a patience that was, in its day, astonishing. Office workers memorized the ritual of tapping a stack's edges against the desk until the corners aligned, a simple percussion that signaled competence, hoping the friction would persuade loose sheets to discover solidarity. Transparent report. Covers embraced a 4 with soft static. Slide binders, which are long plastic letters that do not belong to the alphabet, learn to glide along the short edge with a sound like rain. Whenever standards take hold, they produce small side effects that feel like folklore. A 4's proportions make it surprisingly good for origami that needs symmetrical folds. Office cranes and frogs proliferated during long meetings and were later recycled into minutes. A 3 fits the average office scanner glass exactly, which means the person scanning will at some point flatten a book awkwardly and develop an opinion about hinge stiffness. A 5 notebooks tuck into bags with such grace that entire cultures of bullet journaling grew around that size, full of squares and dots that look like calendars learning to dance. A.O. prints, penned in design studios, create the sensation that a wall has decided to participate in the project. Posters in the B series manage to be slightly larger than you think, which is the correct size for persuading a passerby to attend a lecture on municipal drainage without startling them. You might be wondering about the small marks at the edges. Of some sheets, the crop marks and registration crosses that look like punctuation practiced by cartographers. They exist for the quietest of reasons, to guide trimming and color alignment. Printers print beyond the final edge bleed, as the term cheerfully calls it, and then cut back so color reaches the border instead of stopping shy like a nervous guest at a doorway. The marks give knives something to believe. See MYK registration. Marks, 4 little circles of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, help layers sit precisely atop one another so a photograph's shadows do not act independently of its hair. All of this happens so that the person reading the brochure will see only clean edges and not the choreography underneath. Paper is performance with props you are not meant to notice. Standards reached beyond paper into the furniture that holds it. Filing cabinets adopted rails spaced for a 4 or letter, and office planners learned to measure rooms in units of how many cabinets can live along this wall without blocking the emergency exit. Hanging folders developed green felt edges that whisper when you pull them. The humble in-tray became an altar with 3 tiers, in out, and let's think about this after lunch. Label makers, which are tiny printing presses with a sense of purpose, minted rectangles of adhesive that named these trays with a calm usually reserved for fountains. Desks chose depths that allowed an A4 to lie landscape without falling off, a choice that resets the ergonomics of elbows. Whiteboards and flip charts sized themselves to a series logic so that a sheet torn off could pretend to be a poster later. There is also a museum of misfits worth visiting in your head. Legal size, longer than letter, is a stubborn survivor where contracts like to breathe. Executive size, smaller, suggests that meetings might be shorter if the paper were too. Tabloid and ledger are landscape cousins of North American letter, ready for spreadsheets that unspool like picnic blankets. In the ISO world, there are also SRA sizes, supplementary raw format A, slightly larger than standard so printers can bleed and then trend to perfection. None of these will bother you in your sleep, but they will sit quietly in catalogs, confident that someone, somewhere, requires exactly that rectangle to feel understood. Every so often, the digital age taps the paper age on the shoulder and asks it to dance. PDFs capture the rectangle as a promise that screens can honor. A PDF with the 4 dimensions will print correctly in Tokyo and in Turin, provided the printer pretends to be awake. Document templates enforce margins with the stern gentleness of a librarian. Monitors with aspect ratios not far from a series make. Reading on screen feel less like translation, yet we still print. We print boarding passes we no longer need to print. We print recipes to keep sauce off the phone. We print forms that were once printed so they could be scanned and then emailed to someone who will print them, before filing them in a cabinet designed for a 4. Paper's bureaucracy became digital. Bureaucracy and brought the paper as a comfort. In emergency kits, lists still recommend copies of important documents, which means a 4 in a waterproof sleeve, the rectangle as heirloom. Some tiny curiosities deserve their own gentle spotlight. Why are many school exercise books in some countries closer to a 5 than a 4? Because small hands and small desks prefer small rectangles, and teachers like to carry 30 of anything without developing opinions about orthopedics. Why do photocopiers offer a 4R? That R stands for rotated, which is the machine's way of saying, please turn your expectations 90 degrees. Why do many books not use asseries at all? Because books are a different tribe with a different ancestry, and their trim sizes octavo, crown, trade, follow a path delightful to bibliographers and irrelevant to staples. Why does the inside of a C4 envelope shine? Because clay coating helps it slide, and because an envelope enjoys small luxuries, especially when it has pledged to protect documents that say official somewhere in the upper right. If you step back, you can watch a century of standardization change how people move in rooms. A 4 taught offices to act like grids. 2 piles side by side equals the width of a keyboard. 4 piles define the square of a meeting, the way 4. Chairs define a lunch. Architects draft cabinets and shelves based on the height of a ream. Mail slots and apartment doors nod to C-series heights. Even the posture of someone reading a 4 elbows on desk, paper angled this much, pen weight that much, is a choreographed gesture learned by millions who have never met. The rectangle becomes muscle memory. Flip it to portrait for letters, landscape. For slides, fold it once for letters that intend kindness, twice for letters that carry decisions. And then there's the sound. Paper has a soundscape. The shush of a single sheet drawn from a ream. The slap as 2A4S align with the desk. The soft rip when a corner catches a staple and remembers too late. The whisper of a sheet sliding into a C5 envelope, air evacuating politely. The crisp insistence of a guillotine trimmer slicing 5 millimeters from an edge so a design may reach the border without anxiety. In offices at night, printers hum to themselves and then sleep, their trays full of a 4 that will be just as rectangular in the morning. A janitor wipes a glass platen where countless documents have pressed their faces as if to make a confession. To light, we can let the story settle into its most comfortable chair now. The miracle of the 4 is not drama, but absence of it. The day goes more smoothly because rectangles agree to behave. A memo fits a folder, which fits a drawer, which fits a cabinet, which fits a room. An invoice prints in Oslo and is filed in Osaka without anyone solving a geometry problem at the counter. A student turns in 4 pages that look like all the other. 4-page essays, and the teacher's eyes think them without moving. None of this is headline work. It is the quiet architecture of daily life, the fabric of arrangement, the reason a cluttered desk can, with 10 minutes and a pack of manila, folders become a geography of control. If sleep has started to close your margins, let it. The rectangle will carry on. Somewhere a standards committee meets and drinks coffee and agrees that nothing needs changing this year. Somewhere a new office orders cabinets and an old office donates theirs, and the rectangles commute between them like commuters who already know the stop to ring. Somewhere a copier refuses to print until someone adds paper to tray 2, and tray 2 accepts a 4 and says nothing. In the morning, you will fold a document once, and it will become a 5, and will slip into an envelope that was made for exactly that. It will feel right in the hand. It will feel inevitable. And when you set it down, square with the edge of the table, you will have unconsciously aligned yourself with square root 2, with a century of grids, with the small, sturdy idea that sometimes the world is simplest when it is the right shape.